This is an episode of Unconfined, the podcast about industrial food animal production and its emerging alternatives. Unconfined is a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu. Mike Milley is our sound engineer and produced our theme music. Your hosts are me, Tom Philpott, and Christine Grillo. Paulette Wilson is our producer, and Natalie Wood-Wright is the executive producer. The opinions expressed here are not necessarily those of Johns Hopkins University or of the Center for a Livable Future. Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of Unconfined Podcast. We have switched our topic for this few episodes to looking at aquatic foods and the sort of various processes and problems and solutions around them. And we have here, I think, our preeminent writer of popular books on aquatic foods, and that is the great Paul Greenberg. He is the author of American Catch and For Fish, and another book on seafood called The Omega Principle. He's also written for many, many publications. And he's also a real, true, experienced fisherman. And I do aspire one day to go out on a boat with Paul because I'm not much of a fisherman myself. And Paul is also teaching in the animal studies program at NYU. And he is here today to talk, just sort of help us get an overview of the U.S. seafood situation. And I think we'll start. I read your book when it came out in 2015, Paul, American Catch. And one thing that I was really impressed about it was that it changed the way I think about seafood. And that is, I think I more or less had this conventional notion that we're getting too much wild fish out of the sea. We're overfishing. We're causing ecological collapse by eating too much seafood, essentially. And we should probably think about eating a little bit less, sort of like the advice that we give people about industrial meat, that, if you eat a little bit less, that would be great, for all sorts of reasons. But you make a really compelling case in American Catch that we're actually not eating enough seafood. Can you just talk us through that case?
Yeah, well, there's seafood and there's seafood, just as there's meat and there's meat. And so what I would say is it's not that we're not eating enough seafood on a total poundage basis, but we're not, as Americans, eating enough from our home coasts. We actually, as Americans, we don't eat a lot of seafood per person per year. We eat about 15 pounds of seafood per person per year, whereas we eat, if you add up all the land food meat, you're talking like 200 pounds. So it's a small part of the American sort of protein portfolio. It's not that we don't eat enough total pounds of seafood. We're not eating enough American seafood. And the reason being that the industrial seafood system of the planet is a very, very globalized one, and we've really become kind of disconnected from our own coast. So here in the United States, we control more ocean than any country on Earth. Sometimes I say almost any other country. There's a sort of back and forth going on with France to some degree. But when you add up all the coasts that we control, basically we're a world leader. Meanwhile, something like 80% of the seafood that we eat is coming to us from other countries. And we're sending about anywhere from a third to half of what we catch here abroad. So it's this whole kind of jumbled up situation where we do have really good and well-maintained and sustainably managed wild fisheries here in this country, but for the most part, we Americans are not reaping the benefit of those well-managed fisheries.
Now, Paul, I understand that a lot of what we do eat, something like half of this, 15 pounds, or maybe even more than half, is imported salmon and shrimp, which tend to be industrially farmed. So talk us through the paradox of us having these incredible wild fisheries, and yet we're eating this sort of industrially farmed shrimp. What's going on there?
to start with, shrimp is by far the most consumed seafood in America. Of those 15 to 18 pounds of seafood that Americans eat per year, around 4 pounds every year is shrimp. And most of those shrimp are farmed, and most of them are coming from other countries. Thailand, China, Ecuador, many, many different countries that have questionable labor practices. And as you might have followed back over the course of the last decade, there have been issues about sea slavery tied up in these shrimp farms, both in the actual processing of and farming of the shrimp, but also in the sourcing of the feed that's fed to these shrimp. So that is a huge portion of the American seafood portfolio. We do have wild shrimp in this country, but nowhere near the amount that Americans seem to want to eat. The salmon story is even murkier. Salmon is the most consumed fin fish in America, shrimp not being even a fish. But salmon is by far the most popular fish that we eat. And we actually, if we were to consume the amount of available wild salmon that we have in this country, we'd probably become pretty close to being able to feed ourselves with our own wild salmon. But actually what we do is send quite a bit of that wild salmon abroad. And mostly what we're eating in this country is farmed salmon coming from Chile, from Norway, from Scotland, which is, as you say, industrially farmed, and then sent to us here in the United States. Meanwhile, there's a third aspect to the salmon story, the wild salmon story. There's a certain portion of the American salmon, wild salmon, that are caught, where the salmon are caught frozen whole, sent to China or somewhere else in Asia, defrosted, boned, filleted, refrozen, and sent back to us double frozen.
Wow. And so what percentage do you reckon of the wild caught Alaskan salmon that we find in supermarket shelves here has gone through that process?
Murky, hard to say, because, the thing is, the labeling on the seafood tends to reflect the last place it touched. So the salmon will say product of China, when in fact it was a product of the United States. But I would say it's pretty common. I'm going to say it's certainly more than 20%. But as to put an exact number on that's hard to find. It's one of the reasons that when I buy wild salmon, I tend to source there are a couple of what are called community supported fisheries that are direct to consumer. The one I use the most frequently is called Iliamna salmon, and you can buy a catch share every year, or a share of that catch every year, and get a bunch of really well frozen fillets that will last you through a winter easily.
So they catch it, break it down, immediately freeze it, and then you get it direct.
It's also, there's a lot that makes for better salmon in the handling of the product. I've been on many different kinds of boats in Alaska, and I've seen many different ways that people either respect or disrespect their fish. In the early days, when people put most Alaskan salmon in a can, right? Because before farm salmon came along, nobody even really had the experience of having a fresh salmon or a well-frozen salmon. So people didn't really care too much about the quality of the fish, and so they would often catch the fish and throw them in the front of the boat, no ice, no bleeding, no nothing. But once farm salmon came onto the market and people had the experience of a better treated fish, at least after it had died, fishermen started bleeding their catch right after they were caught, icing them immediately, and that ends up in a just a much better product in the end. These smaller artisanal companies like Iliamna, single freeze, they are much more attentive to their catch. They're not fishing on an industrial scale, so the quality of the fillets and the taste is just vastly superior.
Paul, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how it is that we got so disconnected from seafood. I mean, as you point out in the book, something like, I think, 40% of our population lives within 10 miles of the coast. And, that makes sense if you think about the coastal metropolises from, Seattle, Houston, all the ones on the East Coast. These are huge population centers. How is it that we've got this huge coastal population and such vanishingly small seafood consumption?
You're looking at kind of 100 to 150 year process that began probably with the advent of freezing technology. Once you're able to kind of freeze fish, it becomes a transportable product. And once you're able to transport product, national boundaries don't seem to make too much difference. So once you could sort of open up the global market and you could have people competing for price from around the world, it was this opportunity for other countries to kind of get into the American seafood supply chain. I think the other thing, too, is that over the years, particularly in the last 30 years, the coast has become so much more valuable to Americans as real estate rather than as a place, as a food system. As one fisherman said to me, you hear about old fish processing plants, fish houses, getting torn down and replaced by hotels all the time, but you never hear of a hotel getting torn down and replaced with a fish house. So, once that infrastructure started to go away, there used to be huge amounts of canning, processing all up and down both the Pacific and the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast as well. Once that started to disappear, well, if you don't have the physical infrastructure to do the processing, it makes it that much harder to get your product to market. And so as a result, other places like China, like Indonesia, places where labor is abundant, where it can be done cheaply. Because remember, processing fish is fine scale work. It's work with your hands. It's grueling work. Most Americans don't seem to want to do that work, and so a lot of that shifted over to other countries. Which is why, by the way, some of our fish ends up getting sent abroad and double frozen and sent back to us. Again, the other thing, I mentioned at the top of this answer. The freezing thing, though, is really, really key, and it just gets better and better. It starts with Clarence Birdseye in the first part of the 20th century, but it gets better and better to the point where you're able to deploy vessels on the high seas with flash freezing capability. So suddenly you're able to have a fleet like Thailand's or Japan's that can flash freeze their catch at sea. And so, again, it becomes this shelf-stable, easily commodifiable product that can seek out the best market for it at any given moment. So real estate pushing out fishermen on our coast in the one direction, freezing, allowing foreign competitors to come in on the other hand. And sorry, there's one last thing, which is that it's aquaculture. The book that I wrote before American Catch for Fish was really about this push-pull between wild fish and farm fish. And in the last probably 60 years, farm fish has become the fastest growing form of food production or protein production on Earth. And now we've reached the point where there is as much farmed fish being grown as there is wild fish being caught. In the United States, we have very intense NIMBY laws about trying to put fish farms in our local waters. And so places like Canada, places like Chile, places like Norway, Scotland, and China, where there are not that degree of NIMBY laws, there's a huge aquaculture industry in those countries. And again, economies of scale create cheaper product, which in turn allows that product to easily and seamlessly slip into the American market.
Wow. Okay. Now, I think this idea of real estate sort of crowding out fisheries, I think that there's a really sterling example of that, and that is the oyster industry in New York City. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the sort of emergence and later vanishing of that industry. And I think this is a great place to talk about one of the key themes in your book, and that is the sort of relationship between the health of coastal ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems. So yeah, talk a little bit about oysters in New York City.
As the oyster capital of the world, and it used to be that if you were heading up to New York from some other part in the country, people would say, enjoy the oysters, a little bit like, I don't know, go to Florida, enjoy the oranges. When colonists first came to America, to New York, they found huge natural wild reefs of oysters oysters that were so large that it was said that you had to cut them in 4 parts in order to eat them. We mined those out pretty quickly. By the 1820s or so, most of the wild reefs around New York City had been mined out, but they were quickly replaced by an aquaculture industry where they were taking smaller seed oysters, sometimes from the Chesapeake Bay, sometimes from Long Island Sound, and then growing them in New York waters. This worked well and was fine for a while, but as the city grew and as a tremendous influx of sewage started pouring into the New York Bight, it made the oyster industry increasingly risky. And in the early 20th century, 1910s into the early 20s, there were a series of illnesses that broke out. A famous Chicago politician ate a New York oyster in Chicago that had been shipped from New York and promptly died. And that led to the closure of the last New York beds in Jamaica Bay. From a real estate perspective, what is interesting is that the early days of oyster harvesting in New York Harbor, people ate the meat of the oysters, but then they took the shell and they burned it down to make lime, which in turn was used to make hard structure all along the coast of New York City. So those hard bulkheads, those vertical bulkheads, don't work very well for oysters as a place to grow. Oysters like a gradual shoreline, and they need to be what's called intertidal, so they go back and forth between high tide and low tide, or the oysters don't go back and forth, but they sit there while the water goes back and forth. But suddenly, if you sort of armature the entire coast, it just becomes an oyster hostile environment. So the combination of both physical changes to the infrastructure as well as pollution made oyster culture as a business untenable in New York City. I often say, though, that to eat from your own environment, eat from your own waters, is kind of the ultimate act of environmental purity. It shows that your waters are clean enough to be a food system. And what's interesting is that when different communities beyond New York lose their shellfish culture, oftentimes the water quality goes down in concert with that. Like all up and down New England, there's this position called a shellfish constable. And a shellfish constable is responsible for declaring shellfish beds open or closed. Of course, you don't have a shellfish constable if you don't have a shellfish industry. And so what I found in research on American Catch was that there were many instances where the shellfishing community, either because of real estate or because of the economics of the whole thing or for whatever reason, ended up not being able to stay in business. And once they left, then the community got rid of the shellfish constable. And once you get rid of the shellfish constable, then there's nobody to declare the beds open or closed, or pretty much open, actually. And so the default becomes that they're closed. And so this thing that should be a food system is no longer a food system. It's just either a recreation system or a pollution system. And you can see this all in different communities, but where I perceived it most specifically was up and down the Connecticut and further up the New England coast.
Yeah, and the thing about New York City, it's a really interesting detail that it was the actual oyster shells providing the lime that they used to build up these structures. But the city, life on the city became a bit more precarious when you lost those buffers from the oysters, right? And also talk a little bit also about the salt marshes and what role they played in sort of oceanic biodiversity and also in buffering the city from storm.
Yeah, well, so in early New York, and we're talking when we had wild reefs, and we're going back to the early 19th century, there were New York Harbor was much shallower, and it had these ribbons of oyster reef all around that actually broke up the wave energy as it was coming on. So it was actually a kind of a coastal protection system. And I remember when Hurricane Sandy hit here, and I was in the middle of writing American Catch. I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times called An Oyster in the Storm, and it was sort of saying, here I sit at ground zero in Manhattan with the storm about to hit, and what I wish I had were more oysters to protect us from these storms. So we've lost that coastal protection, and as you say, we've also lost throughout the city a very, very important ecosystem, which is called a salt marsh. And oysters are part of salt marshes. They don't always have to be, but they often are. What happens is oysters stabilize and shallow out an estuary where rivers are coming into saltwater. That stabilization and sedimentation that occurs around the oysters allows eelgrass to grow, which further stabilizes the shoreline. And all the sort of nooks and crannies created by the salt marshes and the oysters is great rearing habitat for fish. So one other thing, you asked at the top of the interview, what happened to the American catch? A lot of it we lost because we lost the very infrastructure, the ecological infrastructure that creates more fish. And while we do still have pretty healthy fisheries in this country, it's probably nothing compared to what the Dutch colonists would have found when they sailed into New York, given that so much of the waterfront was given over to literally producing fish. It's funny, I think many times many Americans don't have the experience of seeing what a truly functional, intact aquatic marine ecosystem looks like. And I remember the first time I flew over Bristol Bay in Alaska, which is sort of the salmon heartland of this country, and you see just so many streams and rivers and brooks and rivulets flowing here and there. And I had this moment where it was like, it's kind of like flying over the Corn Belt of Ohio, or whatever, or Kansas, whatever, and instead of corn, this whole territory is given over to producing salmon. And what produces salmon are, rich estuaries with all this kind of stuff. And similar kinds of things would have been for oysters. For those who are sort of curious, and I guess you guys are in Baltimore, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
So not too far from you, if you ever want to see what New York might have looked like, an hour or so up the turnpike, there's a town called Fortescue, New Jersey, and it's right where the Delaware River comes in at the bottom of New Jersey. And, the Dutch colonists referred to the two rivers in their territory that they had colonized as the North River and the South River. The North River was the Hudson, and the South River was the Delaware. And they're very similar in some ways, but unlike the Hudson River estuary, the mouth of Delaware still has these huge expanses of salt marsh and oyster reef. And there are towns there. You always find the history and the names of things. You must have found this in your agricultural research over the years. But down near Fortescue, there's a town called Shell Pile. There's another town called Bivalve. I mean, you don't call a town Bivalve unless there's just a ton of oysters. And so there is still a very good oyster industry in that area. But it is really striking to see just acres and acres and acres of salt marsh with all that eelgrass, with all those incredible oysters, with incredible crab fisheries as well. So, every American should get a chance to lay eyes on what a fully intact, functional marine ecosystem looks like.
And are the oysters from there wild? Because most of the oysters we have now are farmed.
Yeah, I mean, there are wild oysters coming out of southern Jersey. There are still wild oysters coming out of the Gulf of Mexico. They move them around a little bit, but there's no hatchery work that goes on in the Gulf of Mexico, as far as I can tell. But yeah, no, in the Northeast, though, beyond New Jersey, pretty much all oyster production is being done with, you'll have a hatchery where the oysters are grown to what are plantable little tiny oysters, and then are either put in hanging bags or bags on the seafloor. So it's just a different way of doing things, and it's unfortunately once you lose. If you think about what aquaculture does, aquaculture is just basically a simulation of what nature does. So because we've lost these kind of engines of reproduction in nature, we have to basically create the salt marsh in a bottle and create the conditions by which we can create and breed oysters and have larval oysters and set them and all that kind of stuff. It's a shame that we tend to default to aquaculture so often when wild systems, when they're intact, can actually perform so well.
Yeah. I could talk oysters for this whole episode, but I'm forcing myself to go down to the Gulf, which does have its oysters. But one of the things that you do see, I grew up in Texas, going to the Gulf, and I remember, I'm old enough to remember when it was a great place to swim. And I think it may be reemerging as such a little bit, but there was a really dark period in the 70s when there were a bunch of oil spills, and you did not want to swim in any of those beaches in Texas. And talk a little bit about just what a amazing kind of unique ecosystem it is. What a many fantastic fisheries, and the insults that we deliver to it in terms of agriculture, in terms of the oil industry, and how, like, what it would take to revive it as, to put it back on a good foot.
Yeah, you're talking in the Gulf of Mexico, yeah?
Gulf of Mexico, yeah.
Yeah, well, the Gulf of Mexico is basically the end of a giant hose called the Mississippi. And the Mississippi River drains a piece of territory that stretches from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachians. So imagine all that territory, all that elevation descending in water form in the various streams and draws, and then eventually collecting into rivers, and the rivers all converging on the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, on the Mississippi River, and then draining out into the Gulf of Mexico. That means that there's a huge amount of sort of exchange of materials that's going on from the inland portions of the country into the Gulf of Mexico. Once upon a time, all of those streams and draws and rivulets were protected by forests, by marshland, which acted as kind of natural biofilters and kept all of that drainage from overloading the river with nitrogen and other kinds of sort of fertilizing elements that would go into the river. But once we clear-cut the forests, put in crops like corn and soy, left the soil bare for many, many long periods of the year, and started spraying commercial fertilizer over all of that territory, it all drained into the Mississippi and goes out through the mouth in Louisiana. And all of those sort of fertilizer elements, all the nitrogen, all the phosphorus, fertilizes, causes the growth of algae in the Gulf of Mexico. That algae rises up and then eventually dies. And when it dies, it's consumed by bacteria. And when the bacteria consume all that algae, they suck oxygen out of the water. And so now you have an annual dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that varies in size from Rhode Island to Connecticut, or even larger some years. So that's one element of it. The other element of it is that the marsh itself in Louisiana, and again, that's one of those ecosystems that we're losing. It's something like, a football field an hour. I've heard the statistic. I haven't checked in with it recently, but we're really losing it at a tremendous rate. We're losing it in part because water is rising because of fossil fuels, but we're also losing it because the marsh has been cut up over the course of the years to make shipping channels that allow, mostly for the oil industry, to get oil that's drilled offshore, inshore in a more efficient manner. Once you cut a saltwater channel into a marsh, you leave it open for plants that are not so good with a saline environment. The salt gets into their roots, causes it to fall apart. You're also much more subject to wave action, breaking things apart. So all that is causing the marsh to actually literally fall apart. The bright part of the story is that after the BP oil spill, there was a settlement with British Petroleum that, to the tune, I think I want to say on the order of like $10 billion, that is specifically meant for reconstruction and rehabilitation of the Louisiana marshes. Many different projects have been started. They've been trying to figure out ways to accrue more sediment so that the marshes don't fall apart. It's a huge, giant project that's very complicated. And I think that, there is greater and greater awareness about the importance of those marshes. Whether that will be enough to stop the eventual falling apart of the whole Louisiana marsh ecosystem, it's a tough bet to make. But certainly much more people are aware of it post-oil spill than they were before.
And once again, these marshes are kind of engines of biological production there, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
they're
not just for oysters, but also for shrimp. Shrimp, larval shrimp will come in from offshore where they're spawned, and then they'll rear in all of those ecosystems. So, that that thing that we're so I think everyone having seen Forrest Gump kind of associates Louisiana in the South with wild shrimp production, and none of that wild shrimp would exist were it not for the salt marsh that's down there. But interestingly, going back to what we mentioned earlier in the conversation, you have places like Bubba Gump Shrimp, which that sort of franchise of restaurants where they're actually not even sourcing wild shrimp from Louisiana. They're quite often sourcing that shrimp from farms from Asia or South America.
I mean, generally speaking, on a menu in the United States, if you see shrimp, unless it says wild caught, it probably is farm shrimp.
Absolutely. I mean, it's
probably imported farm shrimp.
It's a commodity. It's like the closest equivalent I can think of. It's kind of like the pork of the sea, in that you can feed these things, all kinds of stuff. The operations have really really dense populations of shrimp in these shrimp ponds. They're uniform in size, and there's a whole industrial infrastructure built around growing, feeding, freezing, and shipping shrimp all around the world. And it's a tricky thing too, because not just from a sort of devaluing of the American wild caught shrimp. It's also because it's such a globalized industry now. You have a biosecurity problem where you have different shrimp diseases will break out in hatchery facilities and then literally spread all over the world. So for a while, there've been different diseases, white spot disease, and then most recently there was a disease called early mortality syndrome, EMS. Because people are sharing larvae from all over the world, it can very quickly become a kind of global catastrophe. So, just as they say of, the banana, right, that there's, I think, one species of, or one variety of banana, and if we got a huge banana blight, we'll lose all the bananas. We could very easily lose most of the shrimp that's produced in the world were we to get sort of a COVID level event or a bird flu level event that were to spread around the world.
And you don't have to be that old to remember when shrimp was kind of a luxury product, something you would have on a special occasion and not just a sort of all you can eat kind of idea.
That's right. I mean, it was super fancy. And, you'd get your 4 or 5 shrimp in your shrimp cocktail. That's the way I remember in the early 70s, the most common way that I saw it. But then, you had the advent of all you can eat shrimp, and all you can eat didn't come from just simply people catching more shrimp. It came from having a source for all that shrimp. Now, interesting, I don't know if you saw in the news, but I think Red Lobster filed for bankruptcy in part because I think they were bought by Thai Union, and Thai Union was kind of using Red Lobster as a funnel through for a lot of their shrimp production. And I think there, various issues of cost, production, and all that kind of stuff eventually resulted in Red Lobster becoming an untenable business. And so I think we're seeing Chapter 11 action right now going on with Red Lobster. A lot of it linked back to issues with farm shrimp.
Yeah, and I believe maybe 15 years ago, a couple of executives got fired because they boosted sales with all-you-can-eat shrimp sales, or shrimp specials, and they worked all too well, and people ate a lot of shrimp and took a hit to profits, and a couple of executives' heads had to roll. So it's not the first time the company has been in the crosshairs because of all-you-can-eat shrimp.
Yeah. I mean, all you can eat anything, and this in a world in which more and more people share this planet, all you can eat anything seems to be a pretty bad idea. But nevertheless, we are a gluttonous species, and that seems to appeal to a sort of reptilian part of our brains.
Just to wrap this conversation up, one of your theses is that if we actually prized Gulf seafood, if it became something that we aspired to eat, that we wanted to eat, that we're willing to pay a little bit more for, etc., then consumers would be able to push back on these agricultural insults that you discussed, the oil industry sort of running roughshod. But since we don't, and there's export markets that can take what we don't eat, there's no real interest. There's no sort of consumer push to stop this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's perhaps taking the analogy a little too far, but I was recently killing time by rewatching the Matrix trilogy. And, if you'll recall, right, in the Matrix, we're never aware that we're just being used as batteries, that instead
Right.
we're sort of stuck in this kind of like, this simulation. And I think that to a large degree, the American seafood market is a simulation. We see a big fish counter full of fish, and we assume that means an ocean full of fish. But we don't realize that there are all these industrial processes that give this illusion of false abundance.
Okay, let's really quickly talk about omega-3 fatty acids, which are this sort of key nutrient that we have a deficiency of in our diets. Something you've written about in your book. Talk a little bit about it and why seafood is so important in getting omega-3 fatty acids, and whether does it make sense for us to just go to the grocery store and pick up a bottle of fish supplement of oil supplements from the grocery store, or should we be trying to eat fatty fish to get omega-3s?
Yeah, so omega-3 fatty acids have been associated with lower rates of cardiovascular disease. They seem to have a role in early childhood development of brain functioning. And there is a lot of spin thrown into all of this. There's a lot of correlation when there might not be causation. And it's a little hard to 100% say that omega-3s are the thing that we need for our health. I think that there's a very sizable supplement industry that takes great profit and pleasure in promoting that concept. But the conclusion I came to after looking at the supplement industry, after looking at many different nutritional studies, was that we should, if we want to get the omega-3s that we're looking for, that 2 portions of oily fish a week will probably get you there. You can take a supplement. People do that. The thing, though, about the supplement is that you got to think about what else are you kind of losing in the deal if you don't eat a couple of portions of fish. To my mind, if you eat a couple of portions of oily wild fish, you're replacing an industrial protein like CAFO raised beef or pork or chicken, which has nowhere near the variety of nutrients that a wild fish might have. So there's that. So that's, to me, one reason to do it. The other reason is that to favor just eating the fish versus supplements is that supplements are actually made from the reduction of smaller fish, which are really key parts of the ecosystem. So this reduction industry is something that's kind of grown up over the course of the last 150 years. And something like a third of all wild fish caught are reduced and turned into either animal feed or omega-3 supplements. So to me, I would prefer that there didn't exist a reduction industry, and that if we desperately needed to make use of these little fish, that we would probably be better just eating them directly and eating few of them and leaving more of them in the sea, because guess what? Little fish grow bigger fish, and if we were to leave a lot of those little fish in the sea, we would probably have a lot more bigger fish to eat.
Yeah, and something like oysters are also abundant in omega-3s. Is that correct?
Yeah, oysters, mussels are actually, I think, even a little higher. The thing is that a lot of people don't realize is that fish don't actually make omega-3 fatty acids. They're actually made by phytoplankton. And phytoplankton are then passed up the food chain, eaten by zooplankton, and it's eventually the zooplankton are eaten by these little fish, and then they bioaccumulate in the flesh of these little fish. So if you want to kind of cut cut a few steps out of the process, you can have a supplement that they actually are algae-based omega-3 supplements, which are perfectly good and kind of spare us the need to have a reduction industry. And then, as you say, mussels, oysters, clams, they all subsist off of phytoplankton, and because they do, they have quite high levels of omega-3 fatty acids. So that's another great way to get omega-3s into your diet.
Okay, to wrap up this conversation, I was just realizing that your book came out in June of 2015. That's when it was published.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, 2014.
2014, yeah.
2014. And I realized that we're right about a decade since you've written this thing. And it was, kind of a call to action. It was, things are, basically the message was things are really messed up. We should change them.
Yeah.
10 years have gone on since then. What do you see that is positive in that decade, and what is not getting better at all?
I think there has been the rise of small-scale fish businesses, what are called community-supported fisheries. There has been an uptick in those, so there's more direct-to-consumer options. Oddly enough, the pandemic was helpful to a lot of these because they were able to do direct-to-consumer sales of American-caught seafood. So there was a little bit of an uptick in that. I think from a policy point of view, certain people I sort of threw a football into the air, and a couple other people caught it. Ian Urbina, who is started reporting on ocean issues for the New York Times and eventually started his own nonprofit called the Outlaw Ocean Project. He really looked into this whole question of sea slavery and followed the lead that I had been given, that so much processing was happening abroad and that there was probably some not so great stuff happening with the processing that happened. So the uncovering of sea slavery, all these kinds of things, I can't say that I necessarily caused that reporting to happen, but I think I pointed some reporters in that direction. And so I think there is a greater scrutiny about illegally caught fish, slave caught fish, all that kind of stuff. However, in the numbers, in the big picture, we don't have a major change in where our seafood is coming from. We're still, the vast majority of our seafood is still coming to us from abroad. We are still sending quite a bit of our own seafood to other countries. One likes to think that one had an effect on the world, but you can only say something so much, so many times, and so loud, and hope that other people will hear it. I hope that as we move through to the next whatever weird phase we are in American history, that people will remember that America is a coastal country, that we should feel proud of our ocean resources, we should utilize our ocean resources, and we should protect those resources because they are precious to us, to our health, and to really a sense of who we are as Americans.
I can't think of a better way to wrap up than that, Paul. Thank you so much for being on Unconfined.
My great pleasure, Tom.
Look forward to keeping this conversation going in the future.
Let's do.
This is an episode of Unconfined, a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu.